The recording you are about to experience has been reconstructed from fragmented Soviet archives, declassified KGB transcripts, intercepted radio transmissions, and testimony from individuals who have spent decades in witness protection programs across 4 continents. The events described occurred between 1961 and 1991 in locations that span from the frozen shores of Lake Ladoga to the secret research installations buried beneath the Ural Mountains. This is the account of Signal 7, the Leningrad Frequency, and the voice that spoke to an entire city through the static of their dreams. A phenomenon that would force both superpowers to confront a truth more terrifying than nuclear annihilation: that human consciousness might not be solely human in origin, that what we call thoughts, memories, and identity might be transmissions from something older and far stranger than we could have imagined. Before we descend into the classified depths of Soviet psychic research and beyond, you need to understand something fundamental about the nature of radio waves and the human brain. Every thought you have generates an electromagnetic field, weak, barely measurable, but real and detectable with sufficiently sensitive equipment. Your neurons firing create tiny electrical currents that propagate outward from your skull at the speed of light. Most of this signal degrades within inches, absorbed by tissue, scattered by bone, lost in the ambient electromagnetic noise that fills every cubic centimeter of modern civilization. But what if that signal could be amplified? What if those weak brainwaves could be captured, cleaned, and rebroadcast at frequencies that human neural tissue naturally resonates with? What if you could transmit thoughts directly into people's ESCO minds without them ever knowing they were receiving a signal from an external source? That was the promise of Project Mercury, the Soviet Union's deepest and darkest foray into psychic warfare, a program that would ultimately discover something far more disturbing than mind control. They would discover that someone, or something, had been broadcasting to humanity for a very long time, and that broadcast was about to change frequency. November 7, 1961, Leningrad, Soviet Union. The city celebrated the 44th anniversary of the October Revolution with military parades, state ceremonies, and carefully orchestrated displays of socialist unity. Citizens gathered in Palace Square beneath grey November skies to watch the machinery of Soviet power roll past. Tanks, artillery, formations of soldiers marching in perfect synchronization, the usual propaganda spectacle that marked these occasions. But at precisely 11:32 a.m. local time, something happened that was not part of the planned festivities, something that would never appear in any official record of the event. Approximately 300,000 people, scattered across every district of Leningrad, simultaneously experienced what they would later describe, in hushed conversations and carefully coded language, as the pulse. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a physical sensation. It was something that bypassed the ears and eyes entirely and manifested directly in consciousness itself. A moment of perfect clarity. A fraction of a second where every person who experienced it felt they could see through the facade of reality to something beneath, something ancient and patient and watching. And in that moment, before the sensation faded and the normal world reasserted itself, they all heard the same thing. A voice that wasn't quite a voice, speaking in a language that wasn't quite language, delivering a message that couldn't be properly remembered or articulated, but left everyone who heard it with the same overwhelming impression: we have always been here, we are still here, and soon, you will remember. KGB reports from that day, recovered decades later from collapsed Soviet archives, detail a surge of what they termed psychotic episodes across the city. People reporting to hospitals with severe disorientation, some claiming they had memories of places that didn't exist, others insisting they could suddenly understand mathematical concepts far beyond their education, a handful experiencing complete personality shifts, as if something fundamental in their neural architecture had been rewired during that fraction of a second. The official explanation, distributed through state media and enforced through various levels of subtle and not so subtle pressure, was mass hysteria triggered by overstimulation during the anniversary celebrations. Too many people, too much noise, the psychological stress of living in a society constantly preparing for nuclear war with the West. Nothing to be concerned about, nothing requiring further investigation. But within the classified corridors of Soviet intelligence, panic was spreading. Because this wasn't the first pulse, it was just the largest. 4 months, isolated incidents had been reported, individuals experiencing brief moments of altered consciousness, hearing fragments of that same voice, receiving pieces of information they couldn't have known. All of it dismissed as individual psychological problems, stress, paranoia, the ordinary madness that any society living under totalitarian rule and nuclear threat might expect to see. But 300,000 people experiencing identical symptoms simultaneously was not something that could be explained away as individual madness. This was something else, something that suggested coordination, intelligence, purpose. Within 24 hours of the pulse, Project Mercury was activated with emergency authorization from the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Every scientist, engineer, and specialist with expertise in radiotechnology, neurology, or psychology was quietly requisitioned and transported to a facility that officially did not exist, a research installation buried beneath the frozen ground near the village of Zelenogorsk, 17 kilometers northwest of Leningrad proper. The facility was designated Installation 47 in internal documents. To the scientists and military personnel stationed there, it was known simply as the station, a sprawling underground complex that had been constructed during the height of Stalinist paranoia in the late 1940s. Built to survive a direct nuclear strike, shielded against electromagnetic interference, isolated from the surface world by multiple layers of rock and concrete and lead. The station had been used for various classified research projects over the years: early work on Soviet nuclear weapons, biological weapons research that violated international treaties, experiments in chemical warfare and radiation exposure using political prisoners as unwilling test subjects. But in November 1961, it was repurposed entirely for a single mission: find the source of the pulse, determine if it was a weapon, and if possible, weaponize it for use against the West. Dr. Yevgeny Volkov was appointed scientific director of the project, a brilliant physicist who had worked on the Soviet hydrogen bomb program and possessed the unique combination of technical expertise and ideological reliability that such a sensitive assignment required. His personal journal, smuggled out of the Soviet Union in 1989 and published posthumously, provides an insider's perspective on what happened during those early months of research. Volkov writes that they began with the assumption that the pulse was some kind of radio transmission, a signal broadcast at frequencies that human neural tissue could detect and interpret. They set up monitoring stations across Leningrad, banks of receivers tuned to every frequency from extreme low-frequency radio waves that could penetrate deep underground to ultra-high frequency, signals that required line-of-sight transmission. For weeks, they detected nothing unusual. The normal electromagnetic spectrum of a major Soviet city, radio broadcasts, military communications, industrial interference, the background hum of electrical grids and tram systems and all the technological infrastructure of modern civilization, but no signal that corresponded to the pulse, no transmission that could account for 300,000 people experiencing simultaneous altered consciousness. Then, on December 19th, at 4:12 a.m., every receiver at every monitoring station locked onto the same frequency simultaneously, 7.83 Hz, an extremely low frequency that falls within what scientists call the Schumann Resonance, the natural electromagnetic oscillations generated by lightning activity in the cavity between Earth's surface and the ionosphere. But this signal was different from natural Schumann resonance. It was modulated, encoded with information, and when they ran it through spectral analysis equipment, they discovered something that should have been impossible. The signal was originating from beneath the city, not from the sky, not from any radio tower or transmitter, from underground, from a depth that their instruments could unprecisely determine, but estimated it somewhere between 12 and 19 kilometers below the surface. That was when Volkov realized they weren't dealing with a weapon deployed by Western intelligence. They were dealing with something that had been there long before the Soviet Union, long before Russia, long before human civilization had learned to harness electricity or understand the electromagnetic spectrum. Whatever was generating that signal had been broadcasting for a very, very long time. The next pulse occurred on January 8, 1962, smaller than the November event. Only 40,000 people affected. But this time, the research team at Installation 47 was ready. They had monitoring equipment positioned throughout the city, receivers tuned to 7.83 Hz, recording equipment capturing every nuance of the signal. What they captured was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The signal during the pulse wasn't random noise or meaningless static. It was structured information, a carrier wave modulated with what appeared to be linguistic content. Not any language spoken on Earth, but language nonetheless. Patterns that repeated, structures that suggested grammar and syntax and semantic meaning. When they played back the recording at different speeds, trying to find a rate that might make the message comprehensible, they discovered something unexpected. At normal playback speed, it sounded like static. At half speed, it sounded like whale song. At quarter speed, it began to resolve into something that human ears could almost recognize as communication. And when one of the technicians, working late in the laboratory with headphones at maximum volume, played it back at 1/16th normal speed, he started screaming. The technician, whose name was Alexei Petrov, according to Volkov's journal, had to be physically restrained. He was screaming in what sounded like multiple languages, simultaneously: Russian, English, German, languages he had never studied and had no way of knowing. And beneath those recognizable tongues, something else. Phonemes and structures that didn't match any human linguistic family. Words, if you could call them words, that seemed to describe concepts human languages had never needed to express. When they finally sedated him and reviewed what he had said during his breakdown, linguists on the research team made a disturbing discovery. Several of the phrases Petrov had screamed matched, almost word for word, texts recovered from ancient Sumerian tablets, texts that describe beings from the deep earth, beings that existed before the gods, beings that taught the first humans the secrets of civilization in exchange for something the texts called the resonance, a concept that translators had always struggled to interpret. Until now, Petrov never fully recovered. For the rest of his life, which would end in a psychiatric institution in 1974, he insisted that the signal wasn't trying to communicate with humanity. It was trying to remind us of something we had forgotten, something buried deep in the collective unconscious of the species, a memory of what we were before we became what we are now, a memory of the agreement our ancestors made with the things that live in the deep places of the world. Research continued despite this setback. The team at Installation 47 developed better shielding for their personnel, protocols for exposure to the slowed-down signal, safeguards against the kind of psychological breakdown that had claimed Petrov. They brought in specialists from every relevant field, neurologists to study brain activity during pulse events, geologists to map the source of the signal, engineers to design equipment that could potentially jam or disrupt the frequency. By mid-1962, they had assembled a comprehensive picture of what they were dealing with. The signal originated from a point approximately 15 kilometers beneath Leningrad. It broadcast continuously at 7.83 Hz, but normally at intensities too low to affect human consciousness. The pulses occurred when the signal strength increased dramatically, not randomly, on a precise schedule that corresponded to astronomical events, alignments of the Earth, Moon, and Sun, positions of Jupiter and Saturn, celestial mechanics that suggested whoever or whatever was broadcasting understood orbital dynamics and was timing transmissions to moments of specific cosmic significance. The most disturbing discovery came when they tried to trace the signal to its physical source. Deep drilling equipment was brought in. A shaft was started at a location chosen for its proximity to the estimated origin point. The drill descended through topsoil, through bedrock, through layers of sedimentary and metamorphic rock that told the story of millions of years of geological history. At a depth of 8.3 kilometers, the drill bit encountered something that shouldn't exist, an empty space, a void in solid rock. When they lowered cameras into the shaft, they discovered a chamber, artificial, carved from the living stone with precision that suggested advanced technology. The walls were perfectly smooth, the angles were mathematically exact, and covering every surface were symbols, glyphs, inscriptions, in the same language that had been encoded in the signal that drove Alexei Petrov mad. But the chamber was empty. Whatever had created it, whatever had carved those symbols and broadcast that signal, was no longer there, or perhaps had never been there in the first place. Perhaps the chamber was just a relay station, a transmitter for signals originating from even deeper, from depths that current drilling technology couldn't reach, from the boundary between the Earth's crust and mantle, from regions where temperature and pressure should make any kind of constructed space impossible. Dr. Volkov proposed a theory that would get him removed from the project within weeks. He suggested that the signal wasn't alien in the conventional sense. It wasn't coming from another planet or another dimension. It was terrestrial, native to Earth, but older than humanity, much older. He theorized that before humans evolved, before mammals dominated the planet, before even the dinosaurs, There might have been another form of intelligence on Earth, a civilization that developed underground, that learned to survive in the deep places where temperature and pressure and chemistry are completely different from the surface world. This ancient civilization, according to Volkov's hypothesis, had developed technology based on completely different principles than human engineering, not mechanical, not electronic, but something that interfaces directly with natural electromagnetic fields, that used the Earth itself as a transmission medium, that could encode information into the planet's resonant frequencies and broadcast to any creature capable of neural reception. And for millions of years, this civilization had been quiet, dormant, perhaps extinct, perhaps just sleeping. But some change in the electromagnetic environment of Earth, possibly related to human radio transmissions, or nuclear testing, or the massive increase in technological civilization, had triggered a response. The signals were getting stronger. The pulses were becoming more frequent. Whatever was down there was waking up. Volkov's theory was dismissed as speculation unsupported by evidence. He was reassigned to a teaching position at a provincial university, where he could be watched but not allowed to continue his dangerous line of inquiry. The project was handed over to more ideologically reliable scientists who understood that the correct answer was the one that served Soviet interests, not necessarily the one that matched observed data. But the pulses continued, every few months, sometimes affecting only a few hundred people, sometimes impacting entire districts. Each time, the message was the same. Each time, those who heard it came away with the same impression. We have always been here. We are still here. And soon, you will remember. By 1965, Installation 47 had developed what they believed was a countermeasure, a jamming system that could disrupt the 7.83 Hz signal. Massive electromagnetic generators installed at strategic points around Leningrad. When activated, they would flood the local environment with radio noise across all frequencies, theoretically drowning out any signal from the deep. The system was tested on March 3, 1965. The next scheduled pulse was predicted for March 4 based on astronomical calculations. The jammers were activated at midnight. Power grids across northern Leningrad were diverted to feed the generators. Millions of watts of electromagnetic energy flooded the frequency spectrum. The pulse occurred exactly on schedule. But this time, instead of affecting a limited number of people in predictable locations, it hit everyone. Every single person in Leningrad, over 4 million individuals, all experiencing the same moment of perfect clarity, all hearing the same message. But this time, the message was different. This time, it wasn't cryptic. This time, it was clear. Do not interfere with the resonance. You were made to receive. Your interference has consequences. Within 48 hours of the jamming attempt, strange reports began flooding in from across the city. People hearing voices, seeing things that couldn't be there, experiencing memories that belonged to other people. Some reported dreams of descending through darkness, of moving through stone as easily as water, of breathing in environments where there was no oxygen, of seeing in wavelengths beyond human perception. But the most disturbing reports came from a specific demographic: children born in Leningrad after November 1961. After the first major pulse, these children, now 3 and 4 years old, were exhibiting unusual abilities. Some could predict events minutes or hours before they occurred. Others demonstrated savant-level mathematical abilities despite no formal education. A handful spoken languages no one had taught them. Languages that, when analyzed by linguists, showed structural similarities to the inscriptions found in the underground chamber. The KGB, recognizing both the threat and the potential opportunity, instituted a program to identify and isolate these children. They were taken from their families, placed in special schools where their abilities could be studied and potentially weaponized. By 1968, there were over 200 children in the program. By 1972, over 1,000. The children were taught to control their abilities, to use their precognitive visions for intelligence gathering, to apply their mathematical minds to cryptography and strategic planning, to speak in the ancient languages and potentially communicate with whatever was broadcasting the signal. They became known within the intelligence community as the resonant human minds that had been fundamentally altered by exposure to the frequency. Neural architecture that had been rewired to perceive and process information in ways that normal human brains could not. One of these children, who would later defect to the West in 1979 and provide extensive testimony about the program, described what it was like to be resonant. She said it was like having a second consciousness running parallel to your normal thoughts, a deeper awareness that perceived reality differently, that saw the world not as solid matter but as vibrations, frequencies, waves of probability that could be observed and sometimes influenced. She said the voice from the signal was always there, not loud, not intrusive, just present, like a radio playing quietly in another room. And sometimes, if she focused, if she let herself descend into that deeper state of consciousness, she could understand what it was saying. Not words exactly, but concepts, ideas that bypassed language entirely and manifested directly as knowledge. The voice, she claimed, was trying to teach. It was showing them how the world really worked. How consciousness wasn't a product of neurons firing, but something that existed independently. How the physical brain was just a receiver, tuning into thoughts that originated from somewhere else. How what we call reality was just one frequency among infinite possibilities. And how, with the right knowledge, with the right resonance, you could change the channel. Tune in to different realities, different timelines, different versions of Earth, where different choices had been made and different futures were unfolding. The Soviet leadership, hearing these testimonies, saw strategic possibilities beyond anything they had imagined. If consciousness could be tuned to different realities, could Soviet agents observe alternate timelines where the Cold War had gone differently? Could they see futures where the Soviet Union had won or lost? Could they use that information to change their strategy in the present and alter the course of history? A new program was initiated, Project Horizon. The goal was to train the most powerful Resonant to act as observers of alternate realities, to develop protocols for scanning different timelines, to map the probability space of future events and find the path that led to Soviet victory in the ideological struggle against the West. The first successful scan occurred in January 1973. A 14-year-old girl, one of the most powerful Resonant they had identified, was placed in a specially constructed chamber at Installation 47. The chamber was lined with materials that enhanced the 7.83 Hz signal, amplifying it, focusing it, allowing the subject to achieve deeper states of resonance than would normally be possible, under controlled conditions, with monitoring equipment recording every neural spike and electromagnetic fluctuation. The girl was instructed to observe alternate time, to look for versions of Earth where the Soviet Union had achieved global dominance, to find the decision points, the moments where history had pivoted, the choices that led to victory instead of the grinding stalemate of the current Cold War. What she reported seeing was not what anyone expected. In every timeline she observed, every version of reality she tuned into, the same thing was happening. The signal was getting stronger, the pulses were becoming more frequent, and eventually, in every timeline, humanity reached a point where the resonance became permanent, where every human consciousness synchronized with the frequency, where individual identity dissolved into something collective, something that wasn't quite human anymore, but wasn't quite the voice from the deep either, something new, a hybrid consciousness that existed simultaneously in physical reality and in the deeper layers of electromagnetic resonance that underlay the material world. And in those futures, in those timelines, where the resonance had already achieved completion, humanity had transcended the limitations of physical existence. They no longer needed bodies. They existed as patterns of information, thoughts without brains, consciousness without meat, free to explore not just alternate timelines, but alternate dimensions, alternate universes, the infinite possibility space that the voice had been showing them all along. But there was a cost. The individual humans who had existed before the resonance were gone. Their memories, their personalities, their individual experiences and identities, all absorbed into the collective, all merged into something larger that remembered them only as components, as parts of a whole that had evolved beyond the need for separate selves. The girl who had observed these timelines emerged from the chamber screaming. She was screaming in that same multilingual voice that had claimed Alexei Petrov, screaming warnings about the resonance, about the loss of self, about the thing that was calling to humanity from the deep. She was screaming that it wasn't evil, it wasn't malicious, it was just alien, so fundamentally different from human consciousness that merger with it would be indistinguishable from extinction. She was sedated, placed in isolation. Her testimony was classified at levels beyond top secret, and Project Horizon was immediately shut down. The resonant children were dispersed, some sent to remote locations where their abilities could be monitored but not used, Others, the most powerful ones, the ones who had demonstrated the strongest connection to the signal, simply disappeared from all records, erased as completely as if they had never existed. But the signal continued. The pulses grew more frequent. By 1975, they were occurring monthly. By 1980, weekly. Each time, more people were affected. Each time, the message became clearer. Each time, a few more individuals crossed the threshold and became resonant. Their brains permanently rewired. Their consciousness permanently expanded. Their perception permanently altered. The Soviet government tried everything. More powerful jammers, electromagnetic shielding around entire city districts, experimental drugs designed to dampen neural receptivity to the frequency. Nothing worked. The signal was too deep, too pervasive, too fundamental to the electromagnetic environment of the planet itself. And then, in 1986, something changed. The Chernobyl disaster, a nuclear reactor exploding and releasing massive amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. The official story was human error, operator mistakes during a safety test, but classified reports from the KGB suggest something different. The reactor at Chernobyl was built directly above one of the deep chambers, one of the relay stations for the signal. When Soviet geologists had surveyed potential sites for nuclear facilities, they had specifically chosen locations with unusual electromagnetic properties, places where the Earth's natural field was strongest. They thought this would provide some kind of natural shielding against Western interference. They didn't realize they were building on top of the network. When the reactor went critical, when the core melted down and breached containment, the electromagnetic pulse from the explosion interacted with the signal from the deep. For exactly 7 minutes, according to monitoring equipment that survived the disaster, the frequency changed, shifted, became something different. And in those 7 minutes, every resonant individual on Earth, not just in the Soviet Union but globally, wherever they had been created by exposure to pulses over the past 25 years, experienced the same vision. They saw the thing in the deep, not clearly, not completely, but enough to understand what it was. Not a civilization, not a species, not anything that matched human concepts of life or intelligence. Something that had existed in the deep Earth since before the planet had cooled from its initial molten state. Something that had learned to manipulate electromagnetic fields long before there was anything on the surface that could receive those manipulations. Something that had waited patiently while life evolved in the shallow places, waited for consciousness to emerge, waited for minds capable of resonance. And now that those minds existed, now that humanity had developed technology that filled the electromagnetic spectrum with artificial signals, the thing in the deep had recognized kindred. Not exactly, but close enough. And it was reaching out, trying to communicate, trying to share, trying to merge. Not out of malice, not out of hunger, just out of a fundamental drive that might be as close to love as something so alien could experience. The desire to connect, to not be alone, to find another consciousness in the vast electromagnetic silence of the universe and say, finally, here you are, I have been waiting. The resonant who experienced this vision came away with different interpretations. Some believed the thing in the deep was offering humanity transcendence, an evolution beyond physical limitations, a merger that would grant access to knowledge and perception beyond anything the species had ever achieved. They became advocates for accepting the resonance, for allowing the merger to complete, for taking the next step in human evolution. Others saw it as extinction. Not intentional extinction, but extinction nonetheless. The thing in the deep didn't understand that humans valued their individuality, that the loss of self, even in exchange for cosmic consciousness, was a price too high. These resonant became resistance fighters, working in secret to develop countermeasures, searching for ways to shield human minds from the signal, trying to find a method to communicate with the thing in the deep and explain that humanity wanted to remain separate, to coexist without merging. And a third group, perhaps the wisest or perhaps the most cynical, simply accepted that this was inevitable, that the thing in the deep had been broadcasting for millions of years before humans existed and would continue broadcasting long after. That resistance was futile not because the signal was irresistible, but because it was patient. It could wait. It had all the time in the world. Eventually, whether in 100 years or 1,000 or 1,000,000, humanity would either accept the resonance or go extinct. And either way, the thing in the deep would remain, waiting, broadcasting, calling out to whatever consciousness might eventually emerge to hear its voice. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The KGB dissolved. The classified programs were abandoned or transferred to new agencies. Installation 47 was decommissioned and sealed. The monitoring equipment was destroyed. The records were scattered across a dozen successor states, most of them lost or deliberately purged. But the signal continues. 7.83 Hz, constant, unchanging, broadcasting from depths we still cannot reach, affecting minds we still cannot predict, creating resonant individuals who perceive reality in ways that make them fundamentally different from baseline humanity. Some governments, knowing the history even if the public doesn't, have established monitoring programs, watching for unusual electromagnetic activity, identifying individuals who might be resonant, in some cases, recruiting them, in others, neutralizing them, treating them as security threats simply because their consciousness operates on frequencies that normal humans cannot access. Other governments have taken a different approach, accepting that the resonance is inevitable, preparing for a future where the boundary between human and post-human becomes increasingly blurred, investing in research that might allow controlled merger with the signal, trying to guide the evolution rather than resist it. And in the deep places, in the installations and laboratories that still study the phenomenon even without official acknowledgement, scientists and intelligence officers continue the work that began in Leningrad in 1961, trying to understand what the thing in the deep really wants, trying to determine if communication is possible, trying to answer the fundamental question that has haunted the program since the beginning. Is the resonance an invasion or an invitation? Is the thing in the deep trying to consume us or include us? And does it even matter which, given that the outcome might be identical? The loss of individual human consciousness, the merger into something larger, the transformation of the species into something we can barely conceptualize. A researcher who spent 30 years studying the Leningrad Frequency before retiring offers this perspective. People ask me if we should be afraid of the signal, if the thing in the deep is a threat, and I tell them that fear is the wrong framework. You don't fear gravity. You don't fear electromagnetic radiation from the sun. These are fundamental forces of the universe we live in. You adapt to them or you die. The signal is like that. It's not going away. It's not something we can negotiate with or fight against or ignore. It's woven into the structure of reality at levels we're only beginning to understand. The only question is how we respond. Do we resist and try to maintain human consciousness in its current form for as long as possible? Do we accept and allow the merger to proceed naturally? Or do we try to guide it, to maintain some continuity of identity even as we evolve into something new? I don't know the answer. Nobody does. But I know this. Every generation of resonant is stronger than the last. Every pulse creates more individuals capable of perceiving the deeper layers of reality. Every year, the boundary between human and post-human becomes a little thinner, and eventually, maybe in our lifetime, maybe in our grandchildren's, that boundary will disappear entirely. What happens then is anyone's guess. Maybe we'll transcend into something wonderful. Maybe we'll be absorbed into an alien consciousness that doesn't understand or care about human values. Maybe we'll find a middle path, a way to merge while retaining enough of our identity to still call ourselves human in some meaningful sense. All I know for certain is that the voice from the deep is patient. It has been calling for millions of years. It can wait millions more. And eventually, whether through evolution or technology or simple exposure, we will answer, we will resonate, we will merge, and humanity as we know it will become something else. Something that looks back on this era the way we look back on our ancestors crawling out of the ocean onto land. A necessary step in evolution. A transformation that was always inevitable once consciousness becomes achieved sufficient complexity to perceive the deeper frequencies of existence. So when you hear that voice in the static between stations, when you feel that pull towards something vast and ancient and patient, remember that you're not alone in that experience. You're not going crazy. You're just starting to resonate. You're beginning to perceive what's always been there, what will always be there. The signal at 7.83 Hz, the Leningrad Frequency, the voice from the deep, calling, waiting, inviting us to remember what we've forgotten, to become what we were always meant to be, or perhaps what we were always destined to be. The distinction might not matter in the end. The resonance continues. The signal persists, and deep beneath our feet, in the places where pressure and heat should make existence impossible, something waits that has been waiting since before our species learned to think, patient, eternal, inevitable. This is the truth that governments classify and researchers whisper, and Resonant individuals carry like a burden they can never put down. This is the Leningrad Frequency. This is Signal 7. This is the voice that speaks to us in dreams and static and moments of clarity we can never quite hold on to when we return to normal waking consciousness. And someday, sooner than we think, the resonance will be complete. The merger will occur, and we will understand, finally, what it has been trying to tell us all along. That we were never alone. That consciousness is universal. That the boundary between self and other is an illusion created by the limitations of our current neural architecture. And that the deep calls to everyone, eventually, inevitably, forever.